we see in Wales a sort of nationalist approach, often based on Welsh language. And the majority of people in Wales, I don't think support that. We have an awful lot in common with England. More people in Wales support and believe in the United Kingdom even than in England. Yet we continually are forced to have more and more powers devolved to us because it suits Scotland or suits people elsewhere, or the politicians who benefit from it in Cardiff are always demanding it and saying, oh, if you only give us more powers, we'll be fine.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. We're the channel that asks you to think more and follow less. I'd love it if you could subscribe and hit that little notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content, because we are back with a bang after a week off last week as I was dealing with the Metropolitan Police. But anyway, that's enough housekeeping for me. Let's get today's guest on. I'm absolutely delighted to say that I'm joined by Mark Reckless. Mark is a former MP and a MS for South Wales East and the Abolish the Assembly Party, as well as a lawyer and economist. He hit the news over the weekend as it was announced he's left the Brexit Party, concluding that the party has reached its goal of leaving the EU. He's now seeking to give a voice to those opposed to devolution in Wales. So, hello to you, Mark. It's fantastic to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to see you too.
Now, Mark,
well done for seeing off the Metropolitan Police.
Oh, yes, thank you. Now, Mark, why have you left the Brexit Party? Isn't there a risk that Brexit might not be secured in the way the party campaigned for it to be?
I'm optimistic that we will do a decent deal. No doubt there'll be some bits we'd prefer to be a bit different. But I think 4.5 years on from the Brexit referendum, it's time for our country to move on and deliver Brexit and a prosperous and freer future for the United Kingdom, and we want to celebrate that.
So you're optimistic?
I am.
Why would Wales vote to lose the privileges that come with the Assembly?
Well, I'm not sure what those privileges are, but Wales has been dragged in the wake of Scotland on the devolution journey. Back in 1979, Wales voted 4-1 against devolution. In 1997, the majority was, I think, less than a tenth of the margin that we saw in the Brexit referendum. They're always telling us was close. And we then had another referendum in 2011 in which people were assured that if they did vote for lawmaking powers, this assembly cannot make laws on tax, whatever the result of this vote.
Right.
That statement printed on the ballot paper and has been ignored by politicians. So we had almost an administrative devolution. The powers of the Welsh office were devolved to an assembly, which was essentially having executive and administrative power. And then some lawmaking powers were added on to that with approval in a referendum in 2011. But the system has now changed. So instead of having 20 devolved powers, everything is devolved except what's resolved to Westminster, and people weren't asked their say. The Welsh Assembly has become the Welsh Parliament. They're saying we have to have more politicians, increase our number from 60 to between 80 and 90. And the government in Wales now has the power to increase income tax with the Welsh Parliament without limit. And that's not something people in Wales want. We were promised a referendum before those powers were devolved, and that promise was broken. So for all those reasons, there is, I think, increasing opposition to the powers that the Assembly of Welsh Parliament is now exercising. And I think many more people would like to get rid of devolution and go back to Westminster government on a UK or England and Wales basis, rather than certainly having independence that so many people in Wales are sort of talking about, but very few people support.
Yes, I mean, we've seen what strikes me as a phenomenon where, despite cases falling, lockdowns are announced by devolved administrations. Wales, of course, being one of them that champions this phenomenon, to try and show that they're not entirely useless, and sort of prove their worth when compared to Westminster. Do you agree with that?
You're absolutely right. I mean, part of the problem is the specifics of what they're doing, but a lot of it also is just trying to do things a little bit differently from England just because we can, just for the the sake of it. And at best, that makes it very difficult for people to follow what's happening, because a lot of people in Wales sort of tune into UK media, don't take much interest in devolution. And it's complicated enough, the various changes that have been made by Boris in England and the localization of various restrictions. If you would then add on another layer of complexity in Wales, even if people want to comply with the rules, it's then very difficult to do so. I mean, we had a few weeks of discussion about having a circuit breaker, but because we're Wales, we had to call it something different. So it's called a fire break. More natural phrase might be a firewall, but that could remind people of the Welsh Government's border policy of saying that people from England cannot come to Wales, and putting those sort of restrictions on people from England in a way that's not done actually with a lot of other countries is just playing into a sort of nationalist agenda of trying to make Wales separate and preposterously blaming people from England for the spread of coronavirus, when actually our rates have, if anything, been somewhat sort of higher in Wales. And I don't support what's happening, and a lot of people don't. And the Abolish the Assembly Party gives people an opportunity to fight back against that slippery slope towards independence, where devolution only ever goes one way, with more and more powers devolve. We want to protect and save the United Kingdom.
Absolutely. I mean, a poll recently found that 24% of people would vote to get rid of the National Assembly for Wales in Cardiff. Do you see that actually rising? Do you see that number going up?
I do, and I think it's the coronavirus COVID crisis that's done that, because a lot of people who were skeptical of devolution just sort of tuned out of it, didn't take much notice, thought that's not something that's sort of interesting for them, and very often didn't vote at devolved elections. So Plaid Cymru, the Nationalist Party, do a lot better at devolved elections than they do at Westminster elections, because people who are into devolution and more powers to Wales take part in the elections, and those who are against devolution traditionally haven't. And in Wales, we have, as many people, about 1 in 6 of the population, who've moved to Wales from England, as many as those who say they speak Welsh. Yet the difference in their impact on the political system and engagement with it on devolved matters is huge. But because people are being locked down by Mark Drakeford, the First Minister in Wales for Labour, because the Assembly is deciding all these things that they have to then just obey, a lot of people are pushing back and would prefer to have a UK-wide, and Boris they thought was their Prime Minister, and they find out all his powers in many areas are exercised by this Mark Drakeford guy who they don't support. So I think a lot of those people will come to the polls next May, if the election's allowed to go ahead, and will register their protest, I hope, by voting for the Abolish the Assembly Party.
Do you think devolution is actually destroying the union?
I mean, destroying is a strong word to use. I think devolution is a threat to the union, and primarily because, and this was Ron Davis who said this back, I think in '97, the Welsh secretary then for Labour, who said devolution is not an event, it's a process. And that process is always one way, towards more and more powers. We never give any powers back to Westminster. We're always demanding and taking more and more powers, including now over income tax. And I don't support a federal system, but one advantage of a federal system is you know where you are, and the power balance is relatively stable and it's interpreted by a Supreme Court, but the Constitution sort of sets out which level of government has which powers. And in devolution, we don't have that. We have a process where constantly more and more powers are devolved. And I would like to have seen a sort of settlement where we had some stability. But that's never the case. It's a slippery slope, I fear, towards independence. And for that reason, I think we should do away with it.
Well, Nick Timothy wrote a piece in The Telegraph yesterday, basically arguing for a federal UK. Why is it that you're opposed to federalisation?
I mean, I believe in the United Kingdom. I think one particular difficulty with a federal approach in the United Kingdom is the dominance and size of England. And I haven't read Nick Timothy's piece, and the arguments may be different if your focus is particularly on Scotland and how best do we try and prevent Scottish independence. And it was thought that sort of devolution was the way to do that. And I would question whether that's actually worked out. what I think here in Wales is, we've had enough of just being dragged along in Scotland's slipstream in terms of, what does Scotland demand, or how do we stop Scotland being independent, and then somehow that being imposed in Wales, because I think there is probably a greater commonality between Wales and England. There is a much longer and much more porous border. There are large numbers of people from England in Wales. And
you see that in the Brexit vote, right?
Yeah, I mean, Wales voted to leave. We kept being told but beforehand that, we benefited so much from European money, or it was just English nationalism that's for Brexit. But the proportion who voted to leaving Wales was a little higher than it was in the United Kingdom as a whole. And I think that gives the lie to the idea that Brexit was sort of just some sort of English nationalist project. It was a sort of democratic project, and one that we supported in Wales too.
Mm. Now, finally, Mark, I wonder if you might just summarise for us, get on your soapbox and tell us why Wales, newly as we are, as a United Kingdom, outside of the EU, can actually prosper without this extra layer of expensive assembly. Just another layer of bureaucracy in its lives. Having voted to leave one remote bureaucracy, set out for us why it should vote to leave another.
Well, we've got rid of the MEPs. Now I think it's time to get rid of the AMs, or the MSs, as we're now called, because there's too many politicians. And what we need clarity of who's responsible for what, and we need to be able to hold politicians to account. And at the moment, we've got 40 Welsh members of Parliament who have very little power. They're not allowed to vote on England-only matters, and the things that English MPs sort of vote on are devolved in Wales. So what are these people doing? They're sort of duplicating work at enormous cost. I also fear that they're stopping true accountability of people being held to account democratically for what they do. And we see in Wales a sort of nationalist approach, often based on Welsh language. And the majority of people in Wales, I don't think, support that. We have an awful lot in common with England. More people in Wales support and believe in the United Kingdom even than in England. Yet we continually are forced to have more and more powers devolved to us because it suits Scotland or suits people elsewhere, or the politicians who benefit from it in Cardiff are always demanding it and saying, if you only give us more powers, we'll be fine. The latest, we see this Wales-only lockdown. Yet the First Minister in Wales complains that, he doesn't have the power to give the economic compensation the businesses need. That lies in Westminster. To which the answer is surely that the power to impose a Wales-wide or UK-wide lockdown, that should be for the UK government, because it has the levers and is able to make things work and sort of trade off any health benefits against sort of economic costs in a way that's not happening in Cardiff, where in Wales they're just making things more and more different just for the sake of it, to prove they can, because they have the powers. But people in Wales don't want that. We want to be more prosperous. We want a health system, education system that works, and under devolution, health outcomes, education outcomes, the economy have all got worse compared to England. We want to put that right, and we think the way to do that is to get rid of devolution, abolish the Assembly, or now Senedd, and go back to United Kingdom government, where we're all in it together. We get the support that we need, and we can hold the politicians accountable and get rid of some of the vast costs of this extra government we have.
Well, Mark Reckless, thank you very much for joining Reason today.
Thank you.
Now, if you enjoyed that, please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the little notification bell. I'll see you next time. Thank you.